You wake up. The room is cold. Your hand reaches for a sweater before your brain even finishes the thought. You do this every day. You have never once questioned it. But somewhere in your ancestry, there was a version of you who did not do this. A version with no sweater, no instinct, no idea that skin could be covered at all. So what changed? The honest answer is not what you think. The real answer is far stranger. For most of human history, there was no clothing. Not a little, none. Your ancestors walked through ice ages with bare skin, just like every other mammal on the planet. And then, at some point, that stopped being true. Something flipped a switch. And that switch reshaped the human body, the human mind, and the human sense of self. This is the story of that switch. Get comfortable. You're about to find out why you are wearing what you are wearing right now. Start with the body itself. Your skin is not just a covering. It is a sensor, a regulator, a living thermostat. For millions of years, that thermostat worked alone. Early humans lost most of their body hair somewhere around 1 to 2 million years ago. That single change is one of the strangest events in mammalian history. Almost no other primate is naked-skinned like this. Why would evolution strip away fur in a world full of cold nights and colder winters? The leading explanation involves heat, not cold. Losing fur let early humans sweat efficiently and hunt during the hottest hours of the day, when other predators were resting. Bare skin was an advantage under an African sun. But bare skin is a liability everywhere else, and humans did not stay in Africa. Here is the question that should stop you. If humans lost their fur to survive heat, how did they survive the cold that came next? This is where clothing enters the story, not as a fashion choice, as a biological patch. A technology bolted onto a body that could no longer regulate its own temperature the old way. For a long time, nobody knew when this patch was installed. Cloth does not survive tens of thousands of years. It rots, it decomposes, it vanishes. There are no ancient garments sitting in a cave waiting to be dated. So scientists had to get creative, and the method they landed on is almost unbelievable. They looked at lice. Human head lice and human body lice are, genetically, nearly the same creature. But body lice have one very specific requirement. They need to live in clothing. They cannot survive on bare skin for long, which means body lice could not have existed until clothing existed. In 2003, biologist Ralf Kittler and geneticist Mark Stoneking used this fact to build a molecular clock. By comparing the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice, they estimated when the two populations split. Their answer placed the origin of clothing at roughly 170,000 years ago. Read that number again. 170,000 years. Anatomically modern humans had already existed for over 100,000 years before that point, which means your ancestors spent an enormous stretch of their existence completely uncovered. Clothing was not part of being human from the start. It was a late addition, an upgrade installed partway through the game. A later study, published in 2011 by a team including David Reed, refined the estimate but landed in a similar range. The timing kept pointing to the same era, an era of brutal climate swings, deep glacial cold, and human populations pushing into latitudes their bodies were never built for. So the timing lines up with an ice age. That seems simple enough. Cold weather, so humans invented coats. Problem solved, right? Not quite. And this is where the story gets stranger. Archaeologist Ian Gilligan has spent years studying the relationship between clothing and climate, and his research complicates the simple story. Gilligan argues that clothing was not a single invention triggered by one cold snap. Instead, it appears to have developed in stages, tracking the rhythm of glacial cycles over hundreds of thousands of years. Early humans likely used simple hide wraps for insulation during the coldest periods, then let the habit fade during warmer stretches, only to reinvent more sophisticated versions when the cold returned harder than before. This matters because it means clothing was not remembered the way you might assume. It had to be rediscovered multiple times. Each ice age forced a fresh reinvention of the same basic idea, refined a little further each time it returned. There is also physical evidence that some version of hideworking happened even earlier than the lice data suggests. In 2013, archaeologist Marie Seresi and her colleagues identified specialized bone tools at sites in France dated to around 50,000 years ago, associated with Neanderthals rather than modern humans. These tools, called lissoirs, were used to soften and polish animal hide, a technique still used by leatherworkers today. Neanderthals, a separate human species that lived alongside and eventually alongside your own ancestors, appear to have been processing hides for practical use well before that. So here is the twist. Clothing may not be a uniquely modern human invention at all. It may be older, shared, and more instinctual to the genus than previously believed. The idea of humans as the sole inventors of clothing starts to look too tidy, too flattering, too human-centered. And once clothing existed, something unexpected happened to it. It stopped being just a tool. Think about what a hide wrap actually does beyond warmth. It hides scars. It hides asymmetries. It hides the parts of a body that aging, illness, or injury have changed. Once humans had the option to cover skin, they also gained the option to control what other people saw. Warmth was the entry point. Presentation followed close behind. This is the part that should feel uncomfortably familiar, because the moment covering became possible, covering became social. Different furs signaled different status. Different wraps signaled different roles. Clothing became a language before it became a comfort. Does that sound like something ancient, or does it sound like your closet? Consider what you actually do with your clothes today. You do not dress only for temperature. You dress for the room you are about to walk into. A job interview, a first date, a funeral, a gym. Each one gets a different version of you, built entirely from fabric choices. Your ancestors, huddled through a glacial winter in stitched hide, were solving a survival problem. You are often solving a social one. But the underlying behavior traces back to the same moment. The moment covering became a choice instead of an impossibility. There is a deeper psychological layer here too. Once bodies could be covered, bodies could also be judged for what was revealed or concealed. Shame, modesty, and self-consciousness about the body did not exist as concepts before covering was an option. You cannot feel exposed if exposure was never a variable. Clothing did not just protect the body from weather, it created an entirely new category of human self-awareness, one your uncovered ancestors never had to navigate. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Every time you have felt uncomfortable in your own skin, every time you have chosen an outfit to hide something or highlight something else, you are running a very old piece of software. Software installed somewhere around that glacial threshold when covering first became a choice rather than an impossibility. Your brain treats clothing as identity now, but it began as insulation. There is one more piece of the puzzle worth knowing. Archaeologist Olga Sofer studied impressions of woven plant fiber preserved in fired clay at Upper Paleolithic sites in Central Europe, dated to around 27,000 years ago. These impressions show evidence of actual textile weaving, not just draped hide, far earlier than most researchers had assumed. Weaving is not a simple technology. It requires planning, pattern, and fine motor coordination passed down through instruction. Humans were not just covering themselves. They were engineering increasingly sophisticated systems to do it, generations before agriculture, before writing, before almost anything you would consider civilization. So walk back through the sequence one more time. Bare skin evolved for heat. Fur loss driven by a hunting strategy under an African sun. A slow migration into brutal cold climates that bare skin could never survive alone. A biological patch invented, lost, and reinvented across repeated ice ages. A patch that, once installed, quietly rewired human psychology, turning a survival tool into a social signal, and a social signal into a mirror for shame, status, and identity. None of that happened because someone decided clothing would be meaningful. It happened because covering skin, once possible, could not stay neutral. The moment you can hide something, you start making decisions about what to hide. That decision-making process never stopped. It just moved from hide wraps to hoodies. Here is the quiet truth sitting underneath all of this. You did not choose to care what your clothes say about you. That instinct is not a personality trait. It is an inheritance. It is the same instinct that let a body without fur survive an ice age, then quietly turned into the feeling you get standing in front of your closet, deciding who you are about to be today. You wake up. The room is cold. Your hand reaches for a sweater before your brain even finishes the thought. Only now you know what your hand is actually reaching for. Not just warmth, not just fabric, the oldest surviving decision your species ever learned to make about itself.